6. The sorting machine. If meritocracy is the problem, what is the solution? Should we hire people based on nepotism or prejudice of various kinds, rather than their ability to do the job? Should we go back to the days when Ivy League colleges admitted the privileged sons of white, Protestant, upper-class families with little regard for their academic promise? No. Overcoming the tyranny of merit does not mean that merit should play no role in the allocation of jobs and social roles. Instead, it means rethinking the way we conceive success, questioning the meritocratic conceit that those on top have made it on their own. And it means challenging inequalities of wealth and esteem that are defended in the name of merit, but that foster resentment, poison our politics, and drive us apart. Such rethinking should focus on the two domains of life most central to the meritocratic conception of success: education and work. In the next chapter, I will show how the tyranny of merit undermines the dignity of work, and how we might renew it. In this chapter, I show how higher education has become a sorting machine that promises mobility on the basis of merit, but entrenches privilege and promotes attitudes toward success corrosive of the commonality democracy requires. Colleges and universities preside over the system by which modern societies allocate opportunity. They confer the credentials that determine access to high-paying jobs and prestigious positions. For higher education, this role is a mixed blessing. Making colleges and universities the animating heart of meritocratic aspiration confers on them enormous cultural authority and prestige. It has made admission to elite colleges the object of fevered ambition and enabled a number of American universities to amass multi-billion-dollar endowments. But converting these institutions into the bulwark of a meritocratic order may not be good for democracy, for the students who compete to attend them, or even for the colleges and universities themselves. James Conant's meritocratic coup d'etat. The notion of competitive college admissions as the gateway to opportunity is by now so familiar that it is easy to forget its novelty. The meritocratic mission of American higher education is of relatively recent origin, a product of the 1950s and 60s. During the early decades of the 20th century, admission to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, the influential Big Three of the Ivy League, depended on having attended one of the private boarding schools that catered to upper-class families of the Protestant elite. Academic ability mattered less than coming from the right social background and being able to afford the tuition. Each college had its own entrance exams, but even these were flexibly administered. Many who failed to get a passing grade were nonetheless admitted. Women were excluded. Black students were barred from Princeton and scarce at Harvard and Yale, and Jewish enrollment was restricted by formal or informal quotas. The notion of elite colleges as meritocratic institutions, whose purpose was to recruit and train the most talented students, whatever their backgrounds, to become leaders of society, found its most influential articulation in the 1940s by James Bryant Conant, the president of Harvard University. Conant, a chemist who served as a scientific advisor to the Manhattan Project during World War II, was troubled by the emergence, at Harvard and throughout American society, of a hereditary upper class. Such an elite was contrary to America's democratic ideals, he believed, and ill-suited to governing at a time when the country needed intelligence and scientific prowess as never before. Nicholas Lemon, author of An Illuminating History of Aptitude Testing in American Higher Education, describes the problem as Conant saw it. At Harvard and other leading universities, rich, heedless young men with servants, whose lives revolved around parties and sports, not studying, set the tone for college life. These men went on to dominate the leading law firms, Wall Street banks, the Foreign Service, research hospitals, and university faculties. Lemon writes, all the good places were reserved for members of a certain group, all male, Eastern, high Protestant, privately educated. No Catholics or Jews were allowed, except in rare cases that required of them a careful extirpation of any accent or other noticeable expression of their alien culture. Non-whites weren't in close enough range of membership in the elite to be excluded, and even the fiercest social reformers of the day didn't think to suggest that women ought routinely to participate in running the country. Conant's ambition was to upend this hereditary elite and replace it with a meritocratic one. His goal, Lemon writes, was to depose the existing undemocratic American elite and replace it with a new one, made up of brainy, elaborately trained, publicly spirited people drawn from every section and every background. These people, men actually, would lead the country. They would manage the large technical organizations that would be the backbone of the late 20th century United States and create for the first time ever an organized system that would provide opportunity to all Americans. It was, in Lemon's words, an audacious plan for engineering a change in the leadership group and social structure of the country, a kind of quiet, planned coup d'etat. To pull off this meritocratic coup d'etat, Conant needed a way to identify the most promising high school students, however modest their family backgrounds, and recruit them for elite college educations. He began by creating a Harvard scholarship for talented students from public schools in the Midwest, who would be chosen based on a test of intellectual aptitude. In commissioning this test, Conant insisted that it measure native intelligence, not mastery of academic subjects, to avoid giving an advantage to those who had attended privileged secondary schools. The test he chose for this purpose, a version of an IQ test used by the Army during World War I, was called the Scholastic Aptitude Test, the SAT. In time, Conant's scholarship program was extended to students nationwide. The test he used to select them, the SAT, eventually came to be used to determine admission to colleges and universities across the country. As Lemon observes, the SAT would become not just a way of handing out a few scholarships at Harvard, but the basic mechanism for sorting the American population. Conant's attempt to transform Harvard into a meritocratic institution was part of a broader ambition to remake American society on meritocratic principles. He set out his vision in Education for a Classless Society, an address he delivered at the University of California and published in The Atlantic in 1940. Conant wanted to reclaim for American society the principle of equality of opportunity, now threatened by the development of a hereditary aristocracy of wealth. He cited Frederick Jackson Turner, the Harvard historian who had argued that the closing of the frontier cut off the traditional avenue of American opportunity, the ability to move west, to cultivate land, and to rise through effort and ingenuity unshackled by class-bound hierarchy. The most distinctive fact of the early period of American democracy, Turner had written, was the freedom of the individual to rise under conditions of social mobility. Turner, writing at the end of the 19th century, was perhaps the first to use the term social mobility. Conant called this concept the heart of my argument, and used it to define his ideal of a classless society. Here's how he put it. A high degree of social mobility is the essence of the American ideal of a classless society. If large numbers of young people can develop their own capacities, irrespective of the economic status of their parents, then social mobility is high. If, on the other hand, the future of a young man or woman is determined almost entirely by inherited privilege, or the lack of it, social mobility is non-existent. If social mobility is high, Conant explained, sons and daughters must and can seek their own level, obtain their own economic rewards, engage in any occupation irrespective of what their parents might have done. But what, in the absence of an open frontier, could serve as the instrument of the mobility a fluid, classless society required? Conant's answer was education. As more and more Americans were attending high school, the secondary school system was becoming a vast engine which, if operated properly, could aid us in recapturing opportunity, a gift that once was the promise of the frontier. According to Conant's vision, however, the opportunity that widespread high school enrollment made possible consisted less in the education it provided than in the chance it presented to sort and rank students as candidates for higher education. In a highly industrialized society, abilities must be assessed, he wrote. Talents must be developed, ambitions guided. This is the task for our public schools. Although Conant believed it was important to educate all future citizens as members of a political democracy, this civic purpose of the public schools was secondary to their sorting function. More important than educating young people for citizenship was equipping them, quote, to step onto the first rung of whatever ladder of opportunity seems most appropriate. Conant acknowledged that this sorting role may seem an overwhelming burden to put upon our educational system, but he hoped the public schools could be reconstructed for this specific purpose. The public schools offered a broad recruiting ground for a new meritocratic elite. In support of his notion of culling from each generation those best suited for higher education and public leadership, Conant enlisted a formidable ally, Thomas Jefferson. Like Conant, Jefferson opposed an aristocracy of wealth and birth and wanted to replace it with an aristocracy of virtue and talents. Jefferson also believed that a well-designed educational system could be the mechanism for the selection of the youths of genius from among the classes of the poor. Nature had not vested talent exclusively in the wealthy, but had scattered it with an equal hand among all ranks of society. The challenge was to find it and cultivate it so that the most talented and virtuous could be educated and equipped to govern. Jefferson had proposed a system of public education for Virginia with this aim in mind. Those who did best in free public schools would be chosen to receive at public expense a higher degree of education at a district school. Those who excelled there would receive scholarships to attend the College of William and Mary and become leaders of society. Worth and genius would thus have been sought out from every condition of life, Jefferson wrote, and completely prepared by education for defeating the competition of wealth and birth for public trusts. Jefferson's plan was not adopted, but for Conant, it offered an inspiring precedent for the selective system of higher education he favored, one based on equality of opportunity and social mobility. Jefferson had not used either of those terms. He wrote instead of a natural aristocracy of talent and virtue that he hoped would prevail over an artificial aristocracy founded on wealth and birth, and he described his competitive scholarship plan in language that would have been impolitic in Conant's more democratic age. 20 of the best geniuses, Jefferson wrote, will be raked from the rubbish annually and be instructed at the public expense. Intimations of the tyranny of merit. Seen in retrospect, Jefferson's indelicate language highlights two potentially objectionable features of a meritocratic system of education that our language of social mobility and equal opportunity obscures. First, a fluid, mobile society based on merit, though antithetical to hereditary hierarchy, is not antithetical to inequality. To the contrary, it legitimates inequalities that arise from merit rather than birth. Second, a system that celebrates and rewards the best geniuses is prone to denigrate the rest, implicitly or explicitly, as rubbish, to use Jefferson's term. Even as he proposed a generous scholarship scheme, Jefferson offered an early instance of our own meritocratic tendency to valorize the smart and stigmatize the dumb. Conant addressed these two potential objections to a meritocratic order, the first more directly than the second. Regarding inequality, he frankly acknowledged that his ideal of a classless society did not aim at a more equal distribution of income and wealth. He sought a more mobile society, not a more equal one. What mattered was not easing the gap between rich and poor, but ensuring that people traded places in the economic hierarchy from one generation to the next, some moving up and others moving down from the status of their parents. For one generation at least, and perhaps two, Conant wrote, considerable differences in economic status, as well as extreme differentiation of employment, may exist without the formation of classes. Power and privilege may be unequal, provided they are automatically redistributed at the end of each generation. As for the distasteful image of raking geniuses from the rubbish, Conant did not think the sorting he proposed would valorize those sorted in or denigrate those sorted out. We must proceed from the premise that there are no educational privileges, even at the most advanced levels of instruction, he wrote. No one channel should have a social standing above the other. As things turned out, Conant was too sanguine on both counts. Making higher education meritocratic did not bring about a classless society, nor did it avoid disparaging those excluded for the lack of talent. Some would say these developments simply reflect a failure to realize meritocratic ideals. But as Conant acknowledged, sorting for talent and seeking equality are two different projects. Conant's meritocratic vision was egalitarian in the sense that he wanted to open Harvard and other elite universities to the most talented students in the country, however modest their social and economic backgrounds. At a time when Ivy League colleges were dominated by families of established privilege, this was a noble ambition. But Conant was not concerned with expanding access to higher education. He did not want to increase the number of students attending college. He simply wanted to ensure that those who did attend were truly the most capable. The country would benefit by an elimination of at least a quarter or perhaps one half of those now enrolled in advanced university work, he wrote in 1938, and the substitution of others of more talent in their place. In line with this view, he opposed the GI Bill enacted by FDR in 1944, which provided free college education for returning veterans. The nation did not need more students going to college, Conant thought. It needed better ones. During Conant's 2 decades as president, Harvard's admissions policy fell short of the meritocratic ideals he advocated. By the end of his tenure in the early 1950s, Harvard still rarely rejected the sons of alumni, admitting more than 87% of them. It continued to favor applicants from elite New England boarding schools, accepting most who applied, while holding public school applicants to higher academic standards. This was partly because the prep school students were so-called paying guests who did not need financial aid, but also because their upper-crust pedigree brought the cultural cachet that Ivy League schools still prized. Restrictions on the admission of Jewish students were quietly eased but not eliminated, reflecting a persisting fear that having too many Jews would drive away the upper-class Protestant boys whom Harvard most wished to enroll. The admission of women and attempts to recruit students from racial and ethnic minorities lay in the future. Conant's meritocratic legacy. Although the Harvard of his day did not fully implement them, the meritocratic ideals Conant proclaimed have since come to define the self-understanding of American higher education. The arguments he advanced in the 1940s about the role of colleges and universities in a democratic society have become the conventional wisdom of our day. No longer in dispute, they have devolved into the routine rhetorical fare of commencement addresses and public pronouncements by college presidents. Higher education should be open to talented students of all social and economic backgrounds, ideally without regard for their ability to pay. Although only the wealthiest colleges can afford need-blind admissions and financial aid, it is widely agreed that merit, not wealth, should be the basis of admission. While most colleges evaluate applicants on an array of factors, including academic promise, character, athletic prowess, and extracurricular activities, academic merit is measured mainly by high school grades and scores on the SAT, the standardized test of intellectual aptitude that Conant championed. To be sure, the meaning of merit is fiercely contested. In debates over affirmative action, for example, some argue that counting race and ethnicity as factors in admission violates merit. Others reply that the ability to bring distinctive life experiences and perspectives to the classroom and the wider society is a merit relevant to a university's mission. But the fact that our debates about college admissions are typically about merit testifies to the hold of meritocratic ideals. Perhaps most deeply embedded is Conant's notion of higher education as the primary gateway to opportunity, a source of upward mobility that keeps society fluid by offering all students, whatever their social or economic background, the chance to rise as far as their talents will take them. Drawing on this idea, college presidents ritualistically remind us that excellence and opportunity go hand in hand. The fewer the social and economic barriers to college attendance, the greater the ability of colleges to recruit the most outstanding students and equip them to succeed. As each entering class arrives on campus for first-year orientation, they are lavished with praise for their excellence and diversity, and for the talent and effort that have led to their admission. Rhetorically and philosophically, Conant's meritocratic ideology has won the day, but it has not played out the way he expected. SAT scores track wealth. First, the SAT, it turns out, does not measure scholarly aptitude or native intelligence independent of social and educational background. To the contrary, SAT scores are highly correlated with wealth. The higher your family income, the higher your score. At each successive rung on the income ladder, average SAT scores increase. For scores that put students in contention for the most selective colleges, the gap is especially stark. If you come from a family with an annual income greater than $200,000, your chance of scoring above 1,400 out of 1,600 is 1 in 5. If you come from a poor family, less than $20,000 per year, your chance is 1 in 50. Those in high-scoring categories are also, overwhelmingly, children of parents with college degrees. Beyond the general educational advantages well-off families can provide, the SAT scores of the privileged are boosted by the use of private test prep courses and tutors. Some, in places like Manhattan, charge as much as $1,000 per hour for one-on-one tutoring. As meritocratic competition for college admission has intensified in recent decades, tutoring and test prep has become a billion-dollar industry. For years, the College Board, which administers the SAT, insisted that its test measured aptitude and that scores were unaffected by tutoring. It recently dropped that pretense and entered a partnership with the Khan Academy to provide free online SAT practice to all test takers. Although this was a worthy undertaking, it did little to level the test prep playing field, as College Board officials hoped and claimed it would. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, students from families with higher incomes and education levels made greater use of the online help than did students from disadvantaged backgrounds, resulting in an even greater scoring gap between the privileged and the rest. For Conant, a test of aptitude, or IQ, held promise as a democratic measure of academic ability, untainted by educational disadvantage and the vagaries of high school grades. This is why he opted for the SAT to choose his scholarship students. He would be surprised to learn that high school grades are better than SAT scores at identifying low-income students who are likely to succeed in college. Comparing the predictive power of test scores and grades is a tangled matter. For 2/3 of students, they are more or less aligned. But for those whose SAT scores and grades are discrepant, the SAT helps the privileged and hurts the disadvantaged. While high school grades are to some extent correlated with family income, SAT scores are more so. This is partly because, contrary to long-standing claims by the testing industry, the SAT is coachable. Private tutoring helps, and a profitable industry has arisen to teach high school students the gimmicks and tricks to boost their scores. Meritocracy entrenches inequality. Second, the system of meritocratic admission that Conant promoted did not lead to the classless society he hoped it would produce. Inequalities of income and wealth have deepened since the 1940s and 50s, and the social mobility that Conant saw as the remedy for a stratified society has not come about. The haves and have-nots have not been trading places from one generation to the next. As we have seen, relatively few children of the poor rise to affluence, and relatively few children of affluence fall below the ranks of the upper middle class. Notwithstanding the American dream of rising from rags to riches, upward mobility is less common in the United States than in many European countries, and there is no evidence of improvement in recent decades. More to the point, higher education in the age of meritocracy has not been an engine of social mobility. To the contrary, it has reinforced the advantages that privileged parents confer on their children. Of course, the demographic and academic profile of students on elite college campuses has changed for the better since the 1940s. The hereditary aristocracy of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant wealth that Conant sought to displace no longer predominates. Women are admitted on equal terms with men. Colleges actively recruit for racial and ethnic diversity, and about half of today's Ivy League students identify themselves as students of color. The quotas and informal practices limiting Jewish enrollment that prevailed during the first half of the 20th century have disappeared. The favoritism that Harvard, Yale, and Princeton long accorded young men from upper-class boarding schools receded in the 1960s and 70s. So did the routine admission to Ivy League colleges of any minimally qualified son of an alumnus. Academic standards improved, and median SAT scores increased. The best-endowed colleges and universities adopted need-blind admissions and generous financial aid policies, removing a major financial barrier for promising students of modest means. These are undeniable achievements, and yet the meritocratic revolution in higher education did not bring about the social mobility and broad opportunity that its early proponents expected, and that educational leaders and politicians continue to promise. America's selective colleges and universities ousted the complacent, entitled, hereditary elite that worried Conant. But this aristocracy of inherited privilege has given way to a meritocratic elite that is now as privileged and entrenched as the one it replaced. Though far more inclusive in terms of gender, race, and ethnicity, this meritocratic elite has not produced a fluid, mobile society. Instead, today's credentialed professional classes have figured out how to pass their privileges onto their children, not by bequeathing them large estates, but by equipping them with the advantages that determine success in a meritocratic society. Notwithstanding its newfound role as the arbiter of opportunity and the engine of upward mobility, higher education has not provided a significant counterweight to the rising inequality of recent times. Consider the class composition of higher education today, especially in its most selective domains. Most students at selective colleges and universities are from affluent families. Very few are from low-income backgrounds. More than 70% of those who attend the 100 or so most competitive colleges in the United States come from the top quarter of the income scale. Only 3% come from the bottom quarter. The wealth gap in college enrollment is most acute at the top. At Ivy League colleges, Stanford, Duke, and other prestigious places, there are more students from the wealthiest 1% of families than from the entire bottom half of the country. At Yale and Princeton, only about 1 student in 50 comes from a poor family, that is, in the bottom 20%. If you come from a rich family, in the top 1%, your chances of attending an Ivy League school are 77 times greater than if you come from a poor family, the bottom 20%. Most people from the bottom half of the income scale attend a 2-year college or none at all. Over the last 2 decades, elite private colleges have offered more generous financial aid, and the federal government has increased college funding for students of modest means. Harvard and Stanford, for example, now provide free tuition, room, and board to any student whose family makes less than $65,000 per year. Despite these measures, however, the share of students from low-income families at selective colleges has changed little since 2000, and in some cases has drifted downward. The percentage of first-generation students, the first in their families to attend college, at Harvard today is no higher than it was in 1960. Jerome Karabel, the author of A History of Admissions Policies at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, concludes that the children of the working class and the poor are about as unlikely to attend the Big Three, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, today as they were in 1954. Why elite colleges are not engines of mobility. The academic reputations, scientific contributions, and rich educational offerings of America's leading colleges and universities are admired throughout the world, but these institutions are not effective engines of upward mobility. Recently, the economist Raj Chetty and a team of colleagues undertook a comprehensive study of the role of colleges in promoting intergenerational mobility, examining the economic trajectory of 30 million college students from 1999 to 2013. For each college in the United States, they calculated the proportion of its students who rose from the bottom rung on the income ladder to the top. That is, from the bottom 20% to the top 20%. They asked, in other words, what proportion of students at each college came from a poor family but wound up earning enough to reach the top 20%. Their finding? Higher education today does surprisingly little to promote upward mobility. This is especially true at elite private colleges. Although attending a place like Harvard or Princeton does give a poor kid a good chance of rising, such places enroll so few poor kids to begin with that their mobility rate is low. Only 1.8% of Harvard students and only 1.3% at Princeton rise from the bottom to the top of the income scale. One might expect things to be different at the major public universities, but they too enroll so many already affluent students that they contribute little to upward mobility. The mobility rate at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor is only 1.5%. Its class-skewed profile is similar to Harvard's. 2/3 of its students come from well-off families. Poor kids are even scarcer in Ann Arbor, fewer than 4%, than at Harvard. A similar pattern holds true at the University of Virginia, with a mobility rate of only 1.5%, due largely to the fact that fewer than 3% of its students come from poor families to begin with. Chetty and his team did identify some less famous public universities and state colleges with higher mobility rates. These schools are both accessible to low-income students and successful at helping them rise. Cal State University at Los Angeles, for example, and the State University of New York at Stony Brook enable nearly 10% of their students to rise from the bottom rung to the top, about 5 times the mobility rate of Ivy League colleges and the most selective public universities. But these institutions are the exception. Taken together, the 1,800 colleges and universities Chetty studied, private and public, selective and non-selective, enabled fewer than 2% of their students to rise from the bottom fifth of the income scale to the top fifth. Some might ask whether propelling students in one generation from the bottom quintile to the top is too demanding a test of mobility. But even more modest ascents are relatively rare. At elite private colleges and universities, only about 1 student in 10 manages to rise even 2 rungs on the income ladder. American colleges and universities enable surprisingly few students to rise, despite the fact that attending such places does enhance one's economic prospects. College graduates, especially from prestigious places, do have a major edge in landing lucrative jobs. But these schools have little impact on upward mobility because most of their students are well off in the first place. American higher education is like an elevator in a building that most people enter on the top floor. In practice, most colleges and universities do less to expand opportunity than to consolidate privilege. For those who look to higher education as the primary vehicle of opportunity, this is sobering news. It calls into question an article of faith in contemporary politics, that the answer to rising inequality is greater mobility, and that the way to increase mobility is to send more people to college. Although this vision of opportunity is invoked by politicians across the ideological spectrum, it fits less and less well with the lived experience of a great many people, especially those who lack a college degree but aspire nonetheless to dignified work and a decent life. This is a reasonable aspiration that a meritocratic society ignores at its peril. For the credentialed classes, it is easy to forget that most of our fellow citizens do not have a college degree. Constantly admonishing them to better their condition by getting one, what you earn depends on what you learn, can be more insulting than inspiring. What then to do about higher education? Should it retain its current role as the arbiter of opportunity? And should we continue to assume that opportunity consists in equal access to the meritocratic tournament that college admissions has become. Some say yes, provided we can improve the fairness of the tournament. They argue that the dearth of low-income students in higher education points not to a flaw in meritocratic admissions, but to a failure to implement them consistently. According to this view, the cure for meritocracy's ills is a more thoroughgoing meritocracy, one that gives talented students equal access to college, whatever their social and economic background. Making meritocracy more fair. On its face, this is a sensible position. Improving educational opportunities for poor but gifted students is an unqualified good. In recent decades, colleges and universities have made important strides in recruiting African American and Latinx students, but have done little to increase the proportion of lower-income students. In fact, as public debate has raged about affirmative action for racial and ethnic minorities, colleges have quietly practiced what amounts to affirmative action for the wealthy. For example, many selective colleges and universities give preference to the children of alumni, legacies, as they are called, on the grounds that admitting them builds community spirit and generates gifts to the endowment. At elite colleges, alumni children are as much as 6 times more likely than other applicants to win admission. Overall, Harvard admits only 1 applicant in 20 of legacy applicants. It accepts 1 out of 3. Some schools also ease academic standards to admit children of wealthy donors who are not alumni, reasoning that it is worth accepting some less than stellar students in exchange for a new library or scholarship fund. During a fundraising campaign in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Duke University devoted about 100 places per year in the entering class to children of wealthy donors who might not otherwise have been admitted. Although some faculty worried about compromising academic standards, the policy helped boost Duke's endowment and improve its competitive standing. Documents filed in a recent court case about Harvard's admissions policy revealed that nearly 10% of its students are admitted with the help of donor connections. Preferences for recruited athletes is another boon to affluent applicants. It is sometimes assumed that lowering academic standards for athletes, especially in high-profile sports such as football and basketball, helps enroll students from underrepresented minorities and low-income backgrounds. But on the whole, applicants who benefit from athletic preferences are disproportionately wealthy and white. This is because most of the sports for which elite colleges recruit are pursued mainly by well-off kids: squash, lacrosse, sailing, crew, golf, water polo, fencing, even horseback riding. Preferential admission for athletes is not limited to powerhouse football schools such as Michigan and Ohio State, whose bowl-bound teams fill massive stadiums. At Williams College, a small prestigious liberal arts college in New England, 30% of the class consists of athletic recruits. Few of these student athletes come from disadvantaged backgrounds. A study of 19 selective colleges and universities, co-authored by the former president of Princeton, found that recruited athletes enjoy greater admissions advantages than either underrepresented minorities or alumni children, and that only 5% of them come from the bottom quarter of the income scale. Colleges could try to address this unfairness in various ways. They could undertake class-based affirmative action by according students from poor families the same preferences they currently give legacies, donor children, and recruited athletes. Or they could reduce the advantages they give wealthy applicants by ending these preferences altogether. In addition, colleges could offset the advantages affluent applicants enjoy due to SAT scores, inflated by private tutoring and test prep, by no longer requiring these standardized tests, as the University of Chicago and other schools have recently done. Studies have shown that SAT scores are more likely than high school grades to be distorted as predictors of academic performance by socioeconomic background. Relying on them less would enable colleges to enroll more students of modest means, with little, if any, loss in rates of academic success. These are steps that colleges could take on their own. Government could also intervene to make college admission less biased in favor of the privileged. Senator Edward Kennedy, himself a legacy student at Harvard, once proposed requiring private colleges to make public the acceptance rates for alumni children and report their socioeconomic profile. Daniel Markovits, a Yale law professor and critic of meritocratic inequality, would go further. He has proposed denying private universities their tax-exempt status unless they admit at least half of their students from the bottom two-thirds of the income scale, ideally by expanding enrollments. These measures, whether undertaken by the colleges themselves or by government mandate, would ease the inequality that makes higher education a weak force for social mobility. They would reduce the unfairness of the system by improving access for the less privileged. These are compelling reasons to consider them. But focusing only on the unfairness of the current system begs a bigger question at the heart of Conant's meritocratic revolution. Should colleges and universities take on the role of sorting people based on talent to determine who gets ahead in life? There are at least two reasons to doubt that they should. The first concerns the invidious judgments such sorting implies for those who get sorted out, and the damaging consequences for a shared civic life. The second concerns the injury the meritocratic struggle inflicts on those who get sorted in, and the risk that the sorting mission becomes so all-consuming that it diverts colleges and universities from their educational mission. In short, turning higher education into a hyper-competitive sorting contest is unhealthy for democracy and education alike. Consider each of these dangers in turn. Sorting and the allocation of social esteem. Conant was aware of the risk that converting universities into sorting mechanisms could sow social discord, but he thought this risk could be avoided. His goal was to use testing and tracking to direct each person to the social